My dad grabbed Grandpa's passbook at my wedding, called it trash, and dropped it into ice and champagne while everyone laughed, and then he told me to smile for photos. I fished it out anyway, because the bank's secret inside would flip our family. What would you do today, honestly? If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. I'm going to start with a moment that still makes my stomach turn because it happened in public, on purpose, and it was designed to teach me a lesson in front of people who were supposed to love me. My father took my late grandfather's old passbook, held it up like a joke, and told an entire wedding reception, "Trash belongs with trash." And then he dropped it straight into a bucket of champagne and melting ice like he was dunking my grandfather's legacy and my dignity at the same time. And people actually laughed. Not the polite, awkward laugh either. The real one. The "oh wow, he's hilarious" laugh, because my father knows how to perform cruelty like it's entertainment. And I didn't scream because screaming would have made me the problem, right? And I didn't cry because crying would have made him feel powerful. So I did the only thing I could do without giving him that satisfaction. I plunged my bare hand into that freezing bucket, past the slippery bottles, past the shards of ice, biting my skin, and I grabbed the soggy passbook pages like they were a heartbeat, and I felt the wet paper tear against my fingertips, and I still held on. And in that second, my wedding dress soaked through at the hem, heavy and cold like a punishment, and I could feel eyes on me, phones out, people pretending they were recording, and I stood there dripping champagne like a walking humiliation ritual, and I didn't look at my father, not once, because if I looked at him, he would have smirked. And I would have lost my mind. And then I walked out of my own reception without saying a word, not because I was weak, but because I was finally tired of begging for basic respect from people who used my silence as permission. Now, let me back up a little because I know what you're thinking. How does a grown man do that to his own daughter at her wedding, and why did nobody stop him? And the answer is ugly but simple. In families like mine, the bully is also the leader, and everyone else survives by laughing along. And my father built an entire identity around being the loudest person in the room, the most successful, the most important, the guy who made it. And he trained us to orbit him like planets. Especially me, because I was the one he could shrink without consequences. My brother was the golden boy, my mother was the smiling accomplice, and I was the one who could take a joke, which is just another way of saying I was the one they practiced on. My name is Lena Mercer now, I'm 29, and I work as a trauma nurse, which means I spend my nights in bright lights and alarms and blood and families praying out loud. And I've seen what real pain looks like, the kind that changes a person's face forever. And I'm telling you that what my father did wasn't a joke, it was a message. I can humiliate you whenever I want, even on your happiest day, and you will still be expected to thank me for being here. My grandfather, Samuel, was the only person who never treated me like furniture, and that passbook was his quiet way of saying, "I see what you live with," because he handed it to me earlier that day when the house was still calm, when the makeup and hairspray and fake smiles were still building the picture everyone wanted to post online, and he pressed that worn book into my hand like he was passing me a secret, and he said, "Don't let anyone tell you you're small," and I didn't understand why. He looked so serious until my father grabbed the microphone later like he owned the air. After I walked out, I didn't go to some dramatic movie moment place. I went to the first quiet spot I could find, the back seat of my car, because I needed privacy to breathe. And I sat there with the passbook wrapped in napkins like a wounded bird, and my hands were shaking, not because I was cold, but because I could finally feel the rage I'd been swallowing since I was a kid, and the rage had nowhere to go. And then my phone started buzzing, and of course it was my mother first, because she always called when she needed me to fix the mess my father made, and she didn't ask if I was okay. She said, "Lena, come back inside. People are talking." And I swear to you, I almost laughed because that sentence tells you everything about our family values. Not "I'm sorry," not "he crossed a line," but "people are talking," like the real emergency is public opinion. And then she added, "Your father didn't mean it like that." which is the lie that has kept him comfortable for decades. And then my brother texted, "Stop being dramatic," and my husband, Mark, bless him, didn't know what to do because he was raised normal, so he kept saying, "Do you want me to go handle it?" And I told him no, because men like my father love conflict with men. It makes them feel important, but they love humiliating women even more because it's low risk and socially tolerated. And I wasn't going to let my wedding turn into a chest-thumping showdown where my father gets to be the star again. So I drove. Not far. Just far enough that the noise of the reception couldn't reach me, and I pulled into a quiet lot near the water because Newport at night has that salt air that makes everything feel sharp and honest. And I sat there and opened the passbook carefully, and the pages were wrinkled and stained, ink running in little veins, and I kept thinking, he didn't even look inside. He didn't even bother to check what he was destroying. And that detail bothered me in a very specific way because it proved he wasn't acting out of fear. He was acting out of arrogance, the kind that says, whatever it is, it can't matter because it came to you. And that's when a memory hit me so clearly. It was like a video. Me at 12 years old in my father's study in our big house, kneeling on hardwood, scrubbing a Scotch stain he spilled on purpose while my brother played video games with his feet on the table, and my father sitting there swirling his drink, calm, smiling, watching me work like it was entertainment, and my grandfather stepping forward to help me up, and my father snapping, "Touch that rag, and I'll put you in a home so fast you won't have time to pack your pills." And I remember my grandfather's face in that moment, not fear, not anger, just this quiet calculation, like he was marking the day he'd stop hoping my father would change. That's why the passbook wasn't just old paper. It was my grandfather's long game. And here's the part that matters for what happened next, because this is the how, not just the what. I didn't go home to cry. I went home to preserve evidence, because if you've ever dealt with a manipulative family, you know the first thing they do after they hurt you is rewrite the story so you look unstable. So I took photos of the passbook pages under a lamp. I laid them flat between clean towels. I turned on a fan low so the paper could dry without curling into confetti, and I texted myself a note with the exact time and the exact words my father said into that microphone, because I've learned that details are oxygen when someone tries to suffocate you with lies. And right here, before I go further, I want to ask you something because I'm genuinely curious and I read these comments like a newspaper. Where are you watching from today? What city and state? And have you ever had a family member ruin a milestone and then act like you were the problem for reacting like a human being? Tell me, because I know I'm not the only one who's lived with this kind of smile and swallow it family culture. Now, the next morning, I did something my father would never expect from me, because he thinks I'm the type who folds, the type who forgives fast to keep the peace, the type who apologizes just to stop the tension. But I didn't call him, I didn't confront him, I didn't send a long emotional text he could screenshot and mock. I went straight to Boston, to the downtown branch of First National, because the passbook had the bank name stamped in faded ink and an account number written in my grandfather's careful handwriting, and I had this sick feeling that whatever was in there was bigger than what my father assumed, and I needed to know before my family found a way to pry it out of me. I walked into that bank wearing a coat that still smelled faintly like last night's champagne because I didn't even care, and the lobby was all marble and hushed voices and soft shoes, and I felt out of place in the way you feel when you walk into a room that only respects money and confidence. And I had one of those moments where you think, am I really about to find out my grandfather left me something and my own father tried to destroy it as a joke? And then I remembered the bucket and the laughter and my wet dress, and I thought, yes, I'm really about to find out. Because even if it's $50, it's mine, and it's proof that my grandfather saw me. I approached the counter, and the teller was young, polite, that neutral customer service smile, and I slid the passbook over inside a clear zip bag like it was fragile, and I said, "I need to check the balance on this," and my voice sounded calmer than I felt, and she picked it up with 2 fingers like it might stain her, and she typed, and at first her face stayed bored, and then her posture changed, like a switch flipped in her spine, and her fingers stopped moving, and she blinked at the screen like it was glitching, and then she looked up at me with the kind of expression people get when they realize they're in the middle of something they're not trained for, and she said, very quietly, "Ma'am, please wait here and do not leave." And she stood up so fast her chair bumped the counter, and in that instant I knew my father didn't just throw trash into a bucket. He threw away something he would have killed to control. And my stomach dropped because I realized the bank was about to confirm it. And once that happened, my father was going to come for it like a predator who finally smelled blood, and I stood there in the marble lobby with my damp passbook and my wedding ring still new on my finger, watching the teller hurry away, and I felt the first real shift of my entire life. The moment you realize the person who's always towered over you is only tall because you've been kneeling. The heavy door behind the counter opened, and I saw two men approaching, one in a manager's badge, one in a suit that probably cost more than my first car, and the suited man wasn't looking at my coat or my face. He was looking at the passbook like it was a key, and he said my last name like he already knew it, and right then, before either of them could even finish their sentence, my phone buzzed again. And the name on the screen was my father, and I didn't answer because if I answered, he would hear something in my breathing and know, and once he knew, he would switch from humiliation to extraction, and I was not about to hand him the steering wheel again. So I let it ring, and I watched the manager reach for the passbook with careful hands, like it wasn't paper anymore. It was a live wire, and he said, "Miss Mercer, please come with us." And as I followed them toward a private room in the back, I realized I was walking into the one place my father couldn't bully his way through, with a microphone and a smile, and I also realized something else that made my skin go cold. If this account is what I think it is, my father didn't laugh last night because he knew the truth. He laughed because he assumed I had nothing, and people who assume you have nothing will do anything when they discover you do. They sat me in a private viewing room behind a heavy steel door that shut with a soft, final click, and the sound alone did something to my nervous system because it felt like stepping into a space where the truth couldn't be laughed off, and the room smelled like old paper and furniture polish, the kind of quiet you only get in places where money sleeps, and the manager placed the damp passbook on the table like it was evidence, not a joke. And the suited man introduced himself as Mr. Callahan, regional director, and he didn't offer small talk. He didn't ask about my day. He looked me dead in the face and said, "We've been expecting someone to walk in with this for a long time," and my throat went tight because I didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified, and I said, "Expecting me?" And he answered, "Expecting the rightful beneficiary," like I was a title, not a person. And then he slid a clean cloth across the table and gently dabbed the passbook cover, and the way he handled it made my stomach twist again because my father had dropped it into champagne like garbage, but this man treated it like a key to a vault, and in that moment I realized my father's cruelty isn't just emotional, it's strategic, because humiliating you in public teaches everyone around you how to treat you in private. Mr. Callahan asked for my ID, and my hands were still raw from the ice bucket, and I could see faint red marks where the paper edges had cut me, and I watched his eyes flick to my fingers for half a second, like he noticed, like he filed it away, and then the manager brought in a slim woman from compliance, and she didn't smile. She had the expression of someone trained to detect lies for a living, and she asked me to confirm my full name, date of birth, and the last 4 digits of my social. And as I answered, I could hear my own heartbeat again, not from romance or wedding nerves, but from the simple fear of being seen, because I'd spent my whole life making myself small, and now I was sitting in a leather chair while professionals treated me like I mattered, and it felt almost suspicious. Then Mr. Callahan said, "Before we proceed, I need to ask something that may sound personal," and I braced myself, and he continued, "Is your father Richard Mercer?" And my stomach dropped because I hadn't said his name, I hadn't mentioned him, and I nodded slowly, and he exhaled through his nose like he was trying to stay neutral, and he said, "Understood." And the compliance woman made a note without looking at me. And I knew right then that my father wasn't just a bully in a family, he was a known entity in other rooms too, and that thought made my skin crawl. They left me alone for a few minutes while they retrieved files, and those minutes felt like the longest silence of my life because my brain started doing that thing it does when danger is close, running scenarios like a machine. What if this is nothing? What if it's huge? What if my father already knows and is on his way? What if he calls the bank and tries to block it? What if he says I stole it? And then I remembered my grandfather's hand pressing the passbook into mine, the slight tremble in his fingers, the way he looked at me like he was apologizing for something he couldn't fix while alive. And I realized this wasn't just about money. It was about proof that someone in that family knew I deserved better. The door opened again, and they came back with a thick file folder, the kind that looks too heavy for paper, and Mr. Callahan sat across from me, placed the file between us, and said, "Your grandfather, Samuel Mercer, established a Totten Trust in 1982, and I blinked because my grandfather wasn't a flashy man. He wore the same coat every winter and drove the same car until it wheezed. And a trust sounded like something wealthy families did for fun, not something my quiet grandfather did in secret." And Mr. Callahan continued, "It was set up with one beneficiary. You." And the word "you" landed like a weight, and the compliance woman turned the file toward me, and I saw line after line of typed history, dates, account transfers, dividends reinvested, and I felt dizzy because I could suddenly see the shape of my grandfather's plan. Decades of patience, the kind of patience only someone who's been watching abuse can develop, because when you can't fight the bully directly, you build an exit door for the person being crushed. Mr. Callahan pointed to a section and said, "Your grandfather was an early investor in several equities that substantially appreciated," and he said it like he was reading weather, but my hands started shaking because I could see names, and I could see dollar signs, and I could see a number that didn't belong in my life. And then he turned the document one more inch, so it sat squarely in front of me, and he said, "Current value, $12,400,000, and for a second my brain refused to compute it, like it was a typo, like the decimal point was lost, and I actually laughed once, not because it was funny, but because shock sometimes comes out as a sound, and I said, "That's not possible." And he looked at me calmly and said, "It's very possible, and it's been very real for a long time." I stared at the page, and all I could see was that champagne bucket, my father's grin, the crowd laughing, and the passbook in his hand, and I thought, he held $12 million and called it trash, and that realization did something sharp inside me because it proved he never saw me as a real person, only as a target. And when you realize someone never loved you, only used you, you stop wasting energy trying to earn love they never intended to give. I asked, very carefully, "Is anyone else on this account?" And the compliance woman shook her head once and said, "No other beneficiary. No co-trustee. No secondary claimant." And then Mr. Callahan added, "There are also notes in the file." And he flipped to a page with handwriting I recognized immediately because I'd seen it on birthday cards and grocery lists, my grandfather's script, and I leaned forward and I felt my eyes burn because it was a short note, not dramatic, just direct. "If you're reading this, Lena finally has it. Do not release any information to Richard Mercer. He will attempt control. Verify Lena's identity only. Protect her." And my mouth went dry because my grandfather didn't write feelings. He wrote instructions, and he wrote those instructions because he knew exactly what my father would do the moment he smelled money. I sat back and whispered, "He knew," and Mr. Callahan said quietly, "Yes," and the compliance woman said, "Your grandfather included explicit limitations," and she tapped the page like it was a shield, and she explained that the trust was structured to pay out to me upon his death, but it could also be accessed earlier under specific conditions, and then she asked me to confirm whether my grandfather had passed, and I said no, he was still alive, and she nodded and said, "Then this is Informational for now, but we can still take steps to secure the account, update contact information, set additional fraud protections, and document your appearance today. And I listen closely because this is the part families like mine never teach you. They teach you to be obedient, not informed. And I realized my father's power had always depended on me not understanding systems. While they talked, my phone buzzed again, and again it was my father, and then another call, and then a text, and my skin went cold because he wasn't calling to apologize. He was calling because he knew I'd gone somewhere, and I could almost hear him pacing, the way he does when he's about to turn pressure into obedience. And I didn't answer. But the compliance woman glanced at the screen when it lit up because it was face up on the table, and she raised an eyebrow and said, "That's him." And I nodded, and she said, "Do not respond while you're here." And her tone wasn't advice, it was protocol. And then Mr. Callahan surprised me by saying, "If he contacts the bank, we will not confirm your presence, and we will not disclose anything." And he said it like a promise, and I felt something unfamiliar wash over me. Not comfort, not safety, but support, the kind that doesn't demand repayment in guilt. I asked them the one question my whole life had trained me to ask in silence. "What do I do now?" And Mr. Callahan leaned forward and said, "Now you stop treating this like a family conversation and start treating it like an asset protection situation." And it hit me how absurd my life had been, how I'd been taught to treat cruelty as family issues and money as his domain. And here were strangers telling me the truth I'd never been allowed to say out loud. "Your father is not entitled to you." The compliance woman walked me through steps like she was building a firewall around my life, updating my mailing address to a P.O. box, setting verbal passphrase, adding a note that any caller claiming to be family must be treated as unauthorized. And she asked me if anyone had ever had access to my personal documents. And I almost laughed again because my parents' house had been a file cabinet for my identity since I was a teenager, and I admitted that yes, they had everything, and she nodded. Like she'd expected it, and she said, "We're going to assume attempted fraud." And right then I felt the urgency in my bones because my father wasn't just going to ask nicely, he was going to move fast, and I mean fast because men like him don't negotiate, they take, and they call it leadership. When I left the bank, the winter air hit my face, and it felt like waking up, and I stood on the sidewalk with that damp passbook in my bag, and I didn't feel rich. I felt hunted, because money doesn't just buy comfort, it attracts predators, and in my case the predator already knew my childhood address and my fears, and exactly which buttons make me fold. I got into my car, stared at my phone, and I made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. I wasn't going to fight him with emotion, I was going to fight him with information, because the one thing my father never expects is paperwork that knows more than his ego does. I drove straight home and found Mark at our kitchen island, laptop open, and he looked up and saw my face and said, "What happened?" And I didn't tell him the number first, I told him the threat. "My father is going to come for this." And Mark's eyes sharpened because he's not built like my family. He doesn't confuse love with fear, and he said, "Then we plan like he's already moving." And I pulled the file note from my bag, my grandfather's warning, and I slid it across the counter, and Mark read it once, and then looked up and said, "Your grandfather didn't just leave you money, he left you instructions for war." And right as he said that, my phone buzzed again, and this time it wasn't a call. It was a text from my father that made my blood run cold because it wasn't an apology, it was a command, and it said, "Stop disappearing. We need to talk about what your grandfather left you." And I stared at that line realizing he already knew enough to start hunting, and I also realized something else that made my stomach twist with a different kind of fear. If he knew that quickly, then someone in that room at the wedding, someone who laughed, someone who watched me pull those wet pages out of ice, had already run to him with information, and if he had an informant, then my next move couldn't just be smart, it had to be silent. The second I read my father's text, I felt my body do that old familiar thing, the childhood reflex where your stomach tightens and your brain starts bargaining. Maybe if I answer calm, maybe if I explain, maybe if I soften it. And then I caught myself because that reflex is the leash. That's how he pulls you back into the cage. And Mark saw it in my face immediately, the micro-freeze, the little flinch. And he closed his laptop with one firm click like he was shutting a door on my old life. And he said, "Do not respond." Not yet. And it wasn't said like a suggestion. It was said like a plan. He stood up, walked to our front window, and angled the blinds just enough to look outside. Not paranoid, just precise, and he asked, "Did you park in your usual spot?" And I shook my head because I'd pulled into the back like my hands knew before my mind did, and he nodded and said, "Good. Now we treat your father like an adversary who already has eyes on you." And it sounded dramatic until I remembered the wedding, the laughing, the way my father held that passbook like a prop. And then I remembered what chilled me most, the speed, because he shouldn't have known I went to a bank unless someone told him, and that meant someone in that room was still reporting to him like he was the sun, and they were desperate planets. Mark opened his laptop again, and the screen filled with tabs like a cockpit, county recorder, property tax portal, corporate registry, court docket search, and he didn't waste time with feelings. He started with facts, because facts don't get gaslit, and he said, "Tell me everything that happened at the wedding again, but slow, from the moment your grandfather approached you." And I did. And as I spoke, Mark typed notes like he was building a timeline for a trial, not a marriage. I told him how Grandpa Samuel squeezed my hand twice, the old signal he used when my father was nearby, like "don't react," and then how he pressed the passbook into my palm while my father was distracted shaking hands, and then how my father somehow noticed anyway, how his eyes tracked me like he could smell disobedience, and then how he asked for it in front of people, not privately because he loves public control, and then how he dangled it into the microphone and called it trash, and then how he dropped it into the bucket like he was disposing of me. And Mark's jaw tightened when I described the laughter, not the laughter of strangers, the laughter of relatives who knew my father's cruelty and joined in anyway, because it's easier to laugh with a bully than risk becoming the target. Mark didn't say, "I'm sorry." He said, "Okay. That tells me the informant is close enough to feel entitled to the story." And then he asked the question that made my skin go cold. "Who touched you after the bucket moment?" And I blinked because it was such a specific question, and I realized he was right because the person who touched you afterward is often the same person who goes back to the bully pretending they were the messenger of truth. And I replayed it, the crowd, the cameras, my wet dress, and I remembered my Aunt Carol grabbing my elbow with that fake sweet smile and saying, "Don't be dramatic, honey, your father's under a lot of stress." And Mark nodded slowly like he'd just seen the shape of the knife. And he said, "Carol," and I whispered, "Maybe," and he said, "We will assume Carol until proven otherwise." Then he did something that snapped me out of the emotional fog. He opened a fresh document and titled it in bold, "Mercer Response Plan," and he said, "Here's the thing about people like your father. They don't want to win an argument. They want to control the frame. If he can make you look unstable, he can make you look untrustworthy, and then anything you say after that becomes noise." And I stared at him because I had never heard anyone describe my family dynamic like a strategy before, and it was horrifying and relieving at the same time because it meant I wasn't crazy. I was targeted. Mark asked me for one more thing, the exact words in the bank file note, and I pulled out the photo I'd taken of my grandfather's handwritten instruction, and I read it out loud again, and Mark's eyes narrowed at one line, the one about not releasing information to Richard Mercer, and he said, "Your grandfather anticipated interference." And then he said, "Which means there may already be a paper trail of your father attempting it before." And that's when he opened the bank's publicly available trust dispute guidelines. Then he searched for any known lawsuits involving my father's name and beneficiary and fiduciary, and I watched him move with the calm confidence of someone who isn't afraid of powerful men because he's not emotionally tangled in them. My phone buzzed again, another text from my father. "If you ignore me, you'll regret it." And I felt that old hot shame rise, like being scolded in front of guests, and Mark held out his hand, palm up, and said, "Give me your phone." And I hesitated for half a second. Not because I didn't trust him, but because surrendering my phone felt like surrendering control. And then I realized I'd been surrendering control to my father my whole life, so I placed it in Mark's hand, and he put it in airplane mode and said, You don't negotiate with threats. And my breathing actually slowed. Then he asked me, What exactly did your father say about the cottage? And I told him the part that stuck like a splinter, the way he called it a shack, the way he tried to sound generous while reaching for it, and the moment he threatened to accuse me of elder abuse. And Mark's face stayed neutral, but his voice got sharper when he said, That threat matters. And I asked, Why? And he said, Because it's projection and leverage. He's telling you his playbook. He will weaponize law to make you fold. And then he tapped his keyboard and said, So, we build a counterplay that doesn't require you to argue. We make him sign his own confession. That sentence hit me like a jolt, and my first instinct was to ask how, but Mark didn't start with drama. He started with the boring parts, which is where real power lives. He pulled up the foreclosure notice database for Newport County and searched my father's name, then cross-referenced the mansion's address from old family invitations, then opened the corporate registry for any LLCs tied to him, and I watched the screen fill with small ugly truths, liens, filings, overdue taxes, things my father would never show in a ballroom. And Mark's lips pressed into a line and he said, He's bleeding. And then he said, And bleeding people get sloppy. I asked, Is it really that bad? And he rotated the laptop toward me and showed me a foreclosure initiation date that had started weeks before the wedding. And suddenly the wedding humiliation made more sense, because it wasn't just cruelty for entertainment. It was him signaling dominance while quietly panicking, because men like my father perform strength when they feel weakness, and they overdo it when the ground is already cracking. Mark started building a profile like he was mapping a crime scene, not a family, and he said, Your father's identity is provider and patriarch. If he's insolvent, he will do anything to avoid being seen as small. And then he looked me in the eye and said, That's where your inheritance becomes dangerous, not because you'll spend it, but because he will. And then he asked me, Do you want revenge or do you want safety? And my mouth opened and I almost said both. And then I swallowed because safety is what I'd never had, and I said, Safety. And Mark nodded and said, Good. Then our moves are clean, legal, and irreversible. He outlined it like steps on a checklist, and each step made me feel less like a trapped daughter and more like a person with options. Step 1. We secure the trust with additional authentication and a legal letter on file instructing the bank to refuse any third-party inquiries. Step 2. We lock down my identity with credit freezes at all bureaus, fraud alerts, and a new P.O. box so mail can't be intercepted. Step 3. We consult an estate attorney not to fight my father in court, but to prevent him from dragging my grandfather into probate warfare. Step 4, and this one made my pulse jump. We bait my father into a controlled communication where he reveals intent and admits what he's trying to do on record. I asked, like a recording, and Mark said, Recordings help, but paperwork is better. Paper lives longer. And then he opened a template document and started writing in language that sounded boring and harmless but felt like a trap, because it was framed as a family assistance arrangement, something my father couldn't resist because it flattered his ego, and it positioned him as the hero, helping his clueless daughter handle a sudden financial responsibility. And Mark explained, Your father wants to look like the smartest person in the room. So we give him a room where his signature becomes evidence. I could feel my hands shaking, not from fear now, but from the strange high of realizing that the same arrogance my father used to crush me could be used to corner him, and I hated that it felt good, and I also understood why it felt good, because for once the rules weren't rigged in his favor. Then Mark asked, What's the one thing your father can't resist more than control? And I answered without thinking, an audience. And Mark's eyes lit with that cold focus again, and he said, Exactly. And he started searching upcoming charity events, galas, any place my father might be scheduled to perform, because if my father planned to leverage my inheritance, he'd want to do it where people could witness him saving the family. And right then my phone, still in airplane mode, lit up with a voicemail notification anyway, like the universe was tapping my shoulder. And Mark turned airplane mode off just long enough to play it through speaker, and my father's voice filled our kitchen, smooth at first, then edged, then venomous. "Alyssa, you are not going to embarrass this family again. Call me back now." And Mark paused at mid-sentence and looked at me, and he said, "There's your proof of intent." And my throat tightened because hearing it out loud in our quiet apartment made it sound uglier than it ever sounded in his house. And I realized something painful. Distance doesn't just change geography, it changes clarity. Mark put the phone down and said, "We do not call him back today. We make him wait." And I felt the urge to argue, to rush, to fix, to stop the storm before it hits. And Mark said, "That urge is what he trained into you. We're going to untrain it." And then he leaned closer and said, "Tonight, we draft the message that makes him believe you're scared, confused, and desperate for his help. And then we watch him step into the trap thinking he built it." And as he said that, my laptop pinged with an email notification I hadn't expected, a calendar invite forwarded from my Aunt Carol's address. And the subject line made my stomach drop because it was a VIP suite reservation at a Boston charity gala with my father's name on it, scheduled for Saturday night. And at the bottom of the invite was a single line that felt like a whisper from the enemy. He said, "Make sure Alyssa brings the documents." By Friday morning, we weren't planning anymore, we were executing, because once you realize a person has been training you to flinch for years, the fastest way to break the spell is to stop treating their threats like weather and start treating them like evidence. Mark printed 3 sets of documents on thick paper, not cheap copy paper, because people like my father respect weight and texture more than truth, and he slid them into a navy folder that looked expensive enough to make my father stop questioning and start assuming. The top page was the bait, a clean, simple cover letter that read like I was finally coming to my senses, thanking my father for offering guidance, requesting his help to properly structure the inheritance to avoid unnecessary tax exposure, and casually mentioning that the bank was asking for an updated trustee verification and a beneficiary instruction letter. None of it was illegal language. None of it sounded like a trap. It sounded like a daughter surrendering. Underneath that letter sat the real instrument, the one Mark kept calling the anchor, because once it's signed, you don't need arguments, you don't need raised voices, you don't need the audience to believe you. You just need the ink. The anchor was formatted like a standard fiduciary acceptance packet, the kind my father had probably signed 100 times in his life to flex confidence, but every clause had been surgically tailored. It acknowledged his voluntary assumption of all management responsibility over specified assets. It affirmed he had full knowledge of the asset origin. It affirmed he had reviewed the attached schedule of entities and obligations, and it contained a single paragraph written in plain English that would destroy him if any investigator ever read it. The signer attests under penalty of perjury that all listed accounts, transfers, and structures were created and managed by him, and that any prior representations were accurate and complete. Mark said, "He will skim until he sees the signature line," and I wanted to believe he was wrong because the idea that my father could be that careless felt too convenient. And then I remembered the wedding, the champagne bucket, the microphone, the way he tossed something priceless because he liked the laugh more than he liked knowing the facts. Carelessness isn't an accident with people like him. It's a lifestyle. It's the byproduct of never having consequences. Mark's next move was not glamorous, but it was the kind of detail that separates a dramatic story from a believable one. He called the bank's trust department and put a note on file that any changes to beneficiary instructions required in-person verification with government ID, a unique passphrase, and a notarized affidavit. and he did it in a way that didn't sound like panic. It sounded like routine fraud prevention. Then he opened my credit accounts, put temporary travel notices on anything that could be spoofed, froze my credit with all 3 bureaus, and set up a new secure email alias that only the bank and our attorney would ever see, because one of the oldest tricks in family financial abuse isn't stealing money, it's stealing communication. While he handled that, I drove to the cottage in Newport with a thermos of coffee and a knot in my throat, not because I loved the place yet, but because I needed it to stop feeling like a hostage. The cottage smelled like salt, mildew, and old wood, and the roofline sagged slightly over the back porch like a tired shoulder, and I took slow steps through each room, narrating to myself like I was a trauma nurse doing an assessment, because when you've been trained to minimize your own needs, you have to literally reteach your brain to observe what's in front of you. I checked windows, I checked locks. I found a stack of old utility bills in my grandfather's handwriting, and I took photos of everything, not for nostalgia, for documentation, because if my father tried to claim my grandfather was incompetent, a pattern of maintained bills, consistent signatures, and ongoing home management becomes quiet proof. I didn't cry in that cottage. I got practical. I wrote down the serial number of the water heater. I noted the condition of the roof shingles. I took a photo of the deed copy tucked behind a framed photo, and I placed that deed into a sealed envelope addressed to our attorney, because nothing calms you like knowing the important papers are no longer within reach of a family member's help. On my way back, my phone rang from a blocked number, and I already knew it was him, because my father loves the drama of anonymity when he can't control you openly, and I answered on speaker with Mark listening, and my father didn't say hello. He said, "You've got 2 days to stop playing games." And I let a beat of silence hang before I spoke because Mark told me silence forces a bully to fill the space. And my father does not handle empty space well. "I'm not playing," I said, quiet, careful, a little shaky on purpose, and then I heard the shift in his breathing, that tiny inhale that signals he thinks he's winning. "Good," he said, and then he slid straight into the script he always uses when he wants something. Concern, then shame, then a threat wrapped in love. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said. "You're a nurse, you deal with blood, not money. You're going to get eaten alive by taxes and paperwork, and then you'll come crawling back and you'll blame me for not stopping you." I didn't argue. I didn't defend my intelligence. I did what Mark said. I gave him the version of me he expects, because that's how you get a manipulator to confess his intentions out loud. "I'm scared," I said, and I hated that my voice sounded so believable, because the truth is I was scared, not of taxes, of him. He softened immediately, not because he felt empathy, but because my fear is his favorite currency. "That's why you need me," he said, and then he went where we needed him to go. He started offering solutions that were really admissions. He said he could shelter the inheritance through the family foundation. He said he could reclassify assets so they wouldn't raise flags. He said he had people at the bank who would smooth it out, and each phrase landed like a stamp. Motive, method, access. Mark mouthed, "Keep him talking," and I did. I asked small, innocent questions like, would the bank accept that? And is it legal? And would my name still be on it? And my father, intoxicated by the role of savior, kept explaining. "Don't talk to outside attorneys," he warned, and that alone was a bright red flare, because the only people who fear attorneys are the people doing something they can't defend. Then he brought up the gala like it was a gift. "I'll be in Boston Saturday," he said. "VIP suite, quiet, no drama, bring the papers, we sign, we're done." And I could practically see him picturing the photo op in his head, the triumphant father guiding his confused daughter back into the fold, and I said, "Okay." And he exhaled like he'd just won a war, and then he said the line that made my skin crawl. "And Alyssa, wear something respectable. Don't show up looking like a charity case." When the call ended, Mark didn't celebrate. He immediately saved the recording, backed it up twice, and typed a short memo summarizing the key admissions with timestamps, because if you ever end up in a legal fight, your memory isn't what matters. Your record is. Then he opened a new spreadsheet and built what he called the narrative map, not to tell a story, but to predict moves. What my father thinks he's doing, what he's actually doing, what he'll do next if he's resisted, what he'll do if he thinks he's winning. He predicted, with chilling accuracy, that my father would try to isolate me, that he'd send a family member to guilt me, that he'd dangle reconciliation, and right on cue, my Aunt Carol texted me an hour later with a heart emoji and a message that looked sweet until you tasted the poison. Honey, your dad is trying to protect you. Don't let pride ruin everything. Mark laughed once, a short, humorless sound, and said, "There it is." And he replied from my phone with a simple line that made my stomach twist because it felt like I was playing a role in my own life. "Thank you, Aunt Carol. I'm overwhelmed. Dad's helping me handle the bank stuff Saturday." Then Mark did the most important thing of all. He rehearsed me like this was surgery, because in a high-pressure moment, you don't rise to the occasion, you fall to your training. He stood in our living room and played my father. He mimicked the tone, the little condescension, the fake warmth that turns sharp if you hesitate, and he drilled me on 3 rules. Never argue, never explain, never volunteer new information, and he made me practice moving the folder from my bag to my father's hands like it was a handoff of a controlled substance, slow, deliberate, no fidgeting, no extra words. He made me practice smiling on cue, because my father would be watching for weakness the way sharks watch for blood. And then Mark said, "Now the last piece," and he opened a secure portal on his screen, a government reporting channel, and he began preparing a draft complaint with attachments that wouldn't be submitted yet, but would be ready to submit the moment my father signed, because timing is everything. And the worst mistake people make is they spring a trap and then scramble for follow-through. We weren't going to scramble. We were going to click. Saturday came faster than it should have, and as I stood in the hotel bathroom in Boston, smoothing my dress and pinning my hair, I looked at myself in the mirror, and I didn't see a revenge fantasy. I saw a woman doing the hardest thing she's ever done, walking willingly into the lion's den, not to be brave, but to be free. And then my phone buzzed with a message from my father that wasn't a request, it was a command. "Come to the VIP suite first." No one needs to see this. And as we stepped into the hallway, Mark leaned close and whispered, "Remember, he thinks you're walking in to hand him money." And then he paused, because down the corridor, 2 men in suits were already standing outside the suite door like private security. And one of them looked directly at me and said, "Miss Mercer, your father is ready for you." And my heart did a hard, ugly thump, because that wasn't security for me. That was security to make sure I didn't walk back out. The second that man said, "Your father is ready for you," I felt my body do that old automatic thing it learned as a kid, shoulders tighten, smile flicker on, stomach hollow out, like my nervous system still believed I was walking into his house and not a hotel suite in Boston. And then I looked at the 2 security guys again and realized they weren't there to protect my father from strangers. They were there to protect my father from me changing my mind, because when a narcissist feels control slipping, they don't negotiate, they contain. Mark's hand touched the small of my back, steady and warm, not romantic, tactical, and he whispered, "Breathe, slow, and don't react to anything he says first." And then the suite door opened, and the smell hit me before I even saw him. Expensive cologne, whiskey, and that sharp artificial citrus from hotel cleaning spray, like a stage set pretending to be luxury. My father was standing inside like he owned the air, tuxed jacket perfect, hair perfectly combed, and his smile was already loaded, not happy, not proud, more like a salesman watching a customer walk into a showroom. "There she is," he said too loudly for an audience that wasn't there, because even alone he performs. He stepped toward me, arms spread like he was about to hug, and then he stopped just short, looked me up and down, and said, At least you didn't embarrass me tonight. And that one line did what it always does. It tried to shrink me. I didn't take the bait. I didn't flinch. I smiled politely like a stranger at a bank, and I said, "I'm here because I want this handled correctly." And my father's eyes flicked to the folder in my hand like it was a stake. The suite was big, too big, that weird echo of wealth where everything feels sterile, and there were two men in there I didn't recognize, one older with a thin smile and a gold watch, one younger with a tablet, and my father introduced them like props. "This is Don, my attorney, and this is Nathan. He handles our finances." And I almost laughed because the word "our" was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Mark stepped forward and said, calm and neutral, "I'm her husband." And my father's eyes narrowed for half a second, because he did not like that I had a witness who wasn't emotionally loyal to him. "We can do this quickly," my father said, steering us toward a small table by the window, and he pointed to a chair like he was seating a child. "Sit." And I sat because compliance in small things keeps a manipulator relaxed, and a relaxed manipulator is a sloppy one. He nodded to the younger guy with the tablet, and the guy started talking about timelines and tax exposure and protecting the family legacy, and I watched my father's face while he spoke, not listening to the words, watching the micro-expressions, because my father only truly listens when money or ego is involved. When the younger guy said, "Once the trustee acceptance is executed, it centralizes oversight," my father's chin lifted like a king hearing praise. He reached for the folder, without asking. I didn't hand it immediately. I opened it, slowly, like I was nervous, and I said softly, "Dad, I just need to understand, am I still protected if something goes wrong?" And he turned his whole body toward me, suddenly tender, suddenly fatherly, and if you've never seen that switch flip in real time, it's chilling, because it's not love, it's strategy. "Sweetheart," he said, "that's why I'm here. You would have been destroyed doing this alone." And then he leaned in and lowered his voice like a secret, "And you don't want the IRS digging around, do you?" And that was the tell, that little slip where protecting me became protecting him, because no normal parent hears their child got an inheritance and immediately thinks about investigators. Mark coughed once, like a subtle pattern interrupt, and my father glanced at him with annoyance. "This is family business," my father said, and Mark replied, still polite, "And she is my family." And the air went tight for a second because my father isn't used to a man saying no to him without apologizing. The older attorney slid a pen across the table, smooth as a waiter, and said, "If Mr. Mercer signs as trustee, it streamlines the transfer." And my father smiled at the word trustee like it was a crown. "Let's do it," my father said, and he flipped pages too fast, like speed was intelligence, and that's when he started the real manipulation, the kind that sounds like advice but is actually a threat with perfume on it. "After this," he said, "we're going to get you out of that little cottage situation and into something appropriate. It's not safe out there for you." And I forced my face to stay neutral even though my skin went cold, because he said "not safe" the same way he used to say "you'll be fine," meaning, I decide what happens to you. Then he added, casually, "Also, you'll stop talking to people about this. You got your attention, you got your little dramatic moment, now we go back to normal." And I wanted to ask him, normal for who, because normal for him has always been me swallowing pain so he can keep smiling in public. Instead, I asked a small innocent question that sounded like fear. "Should I sign anything?" And he waved his hand like I was silly. "No," he snapped, then softened again. "No, sweetheart, I sign. You're the beneficiary. This is complicated. Don't confuse yourself." And the older guy nodded along like a bobblehead, and I realized something that made my mouth taste metallic. These men weren't independent professionals. They were extensions of my father's control, hired to make intimidation look official. My father's pen hovered, and he paused, not to read, but to enjoy the moment, like he wanted me to see the exact second he believed he'd won. "You know," he said, Your grandfather would have wanted me handling this. He was sentimental, not smart. And that hit me like a slap because my grandfather was the only person who ever looked at me and saw a person, not a tool. My father signed. He didn't just sign once either, he signed with flourish, initialed where the sticky tabs were placed because of course he trusted the tabs more than the text, and when he finished he slid the folder back like it was done, like I was done. There, he said, you're welcome. And then he stood up immediately, already done with me, because to him, I'm only interesting when I'm resisting or surrendering, and in his mind, I had surrendered. Now, he said, straightening his cuffs, you'll sit out there, smile, and when I announce the foundation expansion, you'll look proud. And I could hear the ballroom faintly through the walls, music and laughter and the clink of glass, and my father loved that sound because it meant witnesses, and witnesses make him feel invincible. Mark reached for my hand under the table, squeezed once, and didn't look at my father. He looked at me like a pilot checking the dashboard, and I gave him the tiniest nod. My father didn't notice. He was already walking to the suite door, already barking at the younger guy to bring the tablet, already telling the older guy, stay close. And then he turned back to me with that practiced smile and said, I'm proud of you for finally listening. And I smiled back, polite and quiet, and said, I learned from the best. And he laughed because he thought it was admiration, not a warning. The moment he stepped into the hallway, Mark pulled his phone out, not dramatic, not shaky, just clean and fast, took a photo of the signature page. And then he did something that made my heart jump. He didn't immediately hit send. He paused and whispered, look at me. And when I looked at him, he said, are you okay? And that one question almost broke me because it was so simple and so rare. Someone checking on me without an agenda, and I swallowed hard and said, yes, even though my throat burned. And then he said, good, because the second we walk out of this suite, your father's going to realize his control is gone. And if you're watching this right now, I want you to answer me in the comments. Would you have walked away the moment you saw those security guys? Or would you have done exactly what I did and played along long enough to get the proof? Because I'm telling you, the difference between surviving a narcissist and being owned by one is whether you're willing to stay calm while your hands are shaking. Mark finally hit send, and his screen showed a confirmation that made my stomach flip, not because it was revenge, but because it was irreversible. My father was in the ballroom now, stepping into spotlight, believing he was about to impress the city with money he didn't earn, and I stood up, smoothed my dress, and followed Mark toward the door, and right as my hand touched the handle, I heard shouting from the hallway, not my father's voice, another man's voice, sharp and official, and then one of the security guys outside the suite turned his head, eyes wide, and said, ma'am, stay inside. And that's when I knew whatever was happening out there was happening faster than my father expected. And then the ballroom music cut off mid-note like someone yanked the plug, and the silence that followed was so heavy it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. The silence after the music cut wasn't normal silence. It was that vacuum silence where you can hear fabric move and someone's heel squeak and a chair leg scrape. And then you hear a man clear his throat on a microphone like he's about to say, ladies and gentlemen, but he never gets the chance because the ballroom doors slam open so hard the sound bounces off the chandeliers, and 6 men in dark suits move in like they've rehearsed it. Fast, straight lines, eyes scanning, hands close to their belts, and my father is still on the stage with that frozen smile that says, this must be a mistake, because in his world, mistakes happen to other people, not to him. I'm standing just inside the suite doorway, half hidden by the security guy who suddenly looks like he's the one who needs protection, and I can see the entire room like a painting, rich people in tuxes and sequins and charity smiles, phones already lifting because humiliation spreads faster than champagne. My father leans toward the mic, trying to control the narrative in real time, and he says, hold on everyone, there's been a technical issue. And he laughs lightly like he can charm the air back into obedience. But the lead agent doesn't laugh. He points and his voice cracks through the room, firm and flat. "Richard Mercer, step away from the podium." And I swear you could feel every person in that room silently deciding whether to pretend they didn't know him. My father doesn't step away. He grips the microphone like it's a lifeline and says, loud enough to make it performative, "Do you know who I am?" And the agent says, "Yes, that's why we're here." And then he says words that make the blood drain out of my face even though I expected them. IRS criminal investigation and DOJ task force, federal seizure and detention. And in that instant the ballroom stops being a party and becomes a courtroom with no judge, just consequences. My father's head turns, slow, like a predator hearing something behind it, and his eyes lock onto me at the sweet entrance, and I see it. The exact moment he realizes I'm not trapped in a script anymore, and for half a second he looks almost confused, like he's watching a lamp talk. Then the confusion becomes rage, raw and ugly, and he raises his voice. "She did this," pointing at me like I'm a criminal interrupting his show. "My daughter did this," and the crowd murmurs because now it's juicy, now it's scandal, now it's entertainment. And I hate that part most of all, that strangers are hungry for my pain the same way my father always was. Mark doesn't let me freeze. He shifts his body in front of mine slightly, not blocking my view, blocking access to me, and he whispers, "We move only when I say." And that's when I notice the security guy at my side has stepped back, like he's suddenly remembering he doesn't get paid enough to get in the middle of federal agents. The lead agent walks up the aisle with the calm of someone who has seen 100 rich men pretend laws are optional, and he stops at the stage, looks up at my father and says, "Sir, hands where I can see them." And my father does the thing he always does when he's cornered. He tries to turn authority into a negotiation. "This is a charity event. There are senators here," he says, gesturing like the room itself is his shield. And the agent replies, "Then they can watch." And that sentence hits like a slap because it's the first time someone has spoken to my father like he's just a man, not a myth. The cuffs come out and the room makes a sound, not a gasp, more like a collective inhale of pleasure and fear. And my father jerks his wrist away once like he might fight. But then he sees cameras and he remembers he needs to look righteous, so he stiffens his spine and says, "This is political." And then he turns again and spits, "You ungrateful little." And his sentence dies because the agent puts a hand between him and the microphone and says, "Stop talking." And my father's lips keep moving. Silently for a second, like he doesn't understand he can be muted. My phone vibrates in my hand with a new message, one line from the secure portal confirmation that Mark had set up days ago. And seeing it makes me dizzy because it means there's no going back, and also because it means for the first time in my life, my father's words can't unmake reality. As the agents guide him off the stage, my father's shoes slip slightly on the polished steps, just a small wobble, but it's enough to crack his image, and I see a woman in pearls lift her hand to her mouth like she's scandalized. And I want to laugh because these people fed off his ego for years and now they're acting like they've never tasted it. My brother, Chase, is at the bar and now he's moving, pushing through bodies with that wild, drunk energy. Face shiny, eyes too bright. And I can tell by his posture, he's not running toward our father to help. He's running toward me to punish, because in his mind, I broke the toy he wanted to inherit. He barrels down the aisle, shoving past a man holding a phone, and the man stumbles, and the phone clatters on the floor, and suddenly everyone's attention pivots from my father's arrest to my brother's charge, like the room wants a second act. Chase points at me and screams my name, not like a brother calling family, like a man calling property, and he keeps shouting, "You ruined everything." And I don't move because Mark's hand tightens around mine like a lock and he whispers, "Stay behind me." And we step backward into the suite. But Chase follows and the security guys hesitate because this wasn't in their plan. They were hired for optics, not to control a messy son. Chase crashes into the sweet doorway, breath hot with alcohol, and his eyes flick around like he's looking for the fastest way to hurt me, and then he sees it on the table, the steak knife from the suite's untouched room service tray, and he snatches it like he's grabbing a microphone, like he wants an audience for violence too. My body goes cold, not dramatic cold, functional cold, the kind nurses get when there's blood, and I remember my own hands pulling wet passbook pages out of ice water, remember my knuckles stinging, and I realize I've been training for this my whole life, not for medicine, for crisis. Chase steps forward with a knife and says, "Give it back," and I hear myself answer, calm and quiet, "It was never yours." And that sentence hits him like a punch because it tells him the truth he's avoided since childhood, that he's been living on borrowed power. He lunges, not skilled, just angry, and Mark moves like he's been waiting for it. He catches Chase's wrist with both hands, twists hard, and the knife clatters onto the marble floor with a sound that makes my stomach flip, and for a split second the suite is just breath and struggle and the hiss of dress fabric as I step back, and then Chase's arm makes a sickening crack, not movie loud, real loud, and Chase screams, not in pain first, in shock first, because for men like him, being stopped is more humiliating than being hurt. He drops to his knees, clutching his wrist, and he looks up at me with tears in his eyes. But they're not regret tears, they're rage tears, the kind toddlers cry when you take a toy away and he spits, "You think you're better than us." And I want to say no, I think I'm finally free of you. But I don't, because the suite door slams open and 2 agents rush in, and suddenly Chase is a case number instead of a prince. One agent kicks the knife away with his shoe and barks at Chase to stay still, and the other looks at Mark, then at me, and says, "Ma'am, are you injured?" And hearing someone call me ma'am while my brother is kneeling on marble trying to breathe through pain is so surreal my brain almost hiccups. I shake my head once, and I realize I'm trembling, not from fear, from release, because the danger didn't come and go. It came and got handled, and for once I didn't have to handle it alone. The agents pull Chase up, not roughly but firmly, and he keeps trying to talk, trying to rewrite reality like our father taught him. "She set him up," he says, "she's lying," and the agent says, "Sir, save it." And I almost cry because save it is what I've wanted to say my whole life but never could. In the hallway, the ballroom is chaos now. People clustered, whispers, phones up, someone laughing too loudly because they're nervous, and my father is being walked away with his hands cuffed behind him, tucks wrinkling at the shoulders, and he turns his head one last time and locks eyes with me, and the hate in his face is so pure it's almost simple, and he mouths something I can't hear, but I can guess, because he's mouthed it in 100 ways my whole life. "You are nothing without me." And here's the thing I need you to understand, if you've ever had a family member like this, the most dangerous moment isn't when they're powerful, it's when they realize you don't need them anymore, because that's when they stop pretending. As the agents move him down the hall, I notice something I didn't notice in the suite. The rich people watching him now aren't sympathetic, they're calculating, like sharks smelling blood, and it hits me that my father's empire was never real loyalty. It was rented admiration, and the second the money froze, the love evaporated. Mark guides me out through a side exit, and the cold Boston air smacks my face clean, and I take a deep breath and it tastes like metal and winter and freedom, but my chest is still tight because I know what's coming next, not from the government, from my family's retaliation, because people like my father don't accept consequences quietly, they try to drag you down with them on the way out. Mark opens the car door for me, and as I slide into the seat, my phone lights up with a call from a blocked number, and I already know who it is before it even rings twice, because only one person in my life calls like they're summoning me, and Mark looks at the screen, then at my face and says, "Do you want to answer?" And I stare at that buzzing phone and realize the next minutes are going to tell me whether my father is going to beg, threaten, or confess, and whichever one it is, it's going To reveal the one secret I still don't have, the thing he's been hiding behind all that champagne and applause, because you don't build an entire life on intimidation unless there's something underneath it that terrifies you. The blocked number kept vibrating like a wasp trapped under glass, and my thumb hovered over the screen because there are two kinds of fear, the kind that runs away from pain, and the kind that runs toward it just to finally end the waiting, and I could feel both in my throat. And then Mark reached over, not grabbing me, just touching my wrist like a reminder that I wasn't 12 anymore, and he said low, "If you answer, you don't give him anything for free." And that sentence alone steadied me. Because my father's whole game was getting things for free, free labor, free loyalty, free silence, free daughters who clean up his mess while he takes credit for the shine. I hit speaker. "Alyssa," my father's voice came through, and it wasn't the gala voice, not the microphone voice. It was the raw voice, the one he used in private when there were no witnesses to impress, and it sounded like he was trying to hold a scream inside his mouth. I didn't answer right away. Silence makes desperate people talk, and my father was now the most desperate man in Massachusetts. "I know what you did," he said, and then he laughed once, sharp and ugly, like the sound of a fork scraping a plate. "You think you're clever. You think you've won, but you don't understand what you've started." Mark's eyes flicked to me, asking without asking, and I kept my voice calm. The same calm I use when a patient's blood pressure drops and the room panics. "Tell me what I started." My father inhaled like he was loading a weapon. "You humiliated me in front of people who matter," he snapped. "People who can make your life very uncomfortable." And I almost smiled because that was still his first reflex. Not remorse, not truth, just power. Like he truly believed the world is a room full of levers, and he's the only one allowed to pull them. "Dad," I said, and I kept it soft on purpose because softness makes a bully lean in. "You threw Grandpa's gift into ice like it was garbage. You called it trash, and now you're calling me from a blocked number like a man hiding under his own bed." There was a pause, and then his voice dropped. "I will bury you in court," he said. "I will sue you for fraud, coercion, elder manipulation. I will tell them you forged everything." I let him talk because here's the thing, when a liar is losing, they start throwing out every lie they've ever used like confetti, hoping one sticks. "Okay," I said, "walk me through it. How exactly did I forge a bank trust from 1982 and then convince federal agents to show up at your gala with a seizure order?" He didn't answer my question. He changed the subject like he always did when he was cornered. "You think that money is yours," he said, "but you don't know what's tied to that money." Mark's posture changed instantly, like a dog hearing the word gun. "What do you mean?" I asked, and I felt my stomach tighten because now we were in the part of the story my father never let anyone see, the basement, not the living room. "That passbook," he said, "that trust." And then he swallowed, and I heard something in his throat that wasn't anger, it was fear. The same fear he used to pour into me like poison so I'd never stand up straight. "Your grandfather didn't just invest," he said. "He hid things." Mark mouthed, "Record," and I tapped my phone's record function with my free hand. Not dramatic, just practical, because if you're watching and you're older and you've ever dealt with a family bully, you already know they don't admit the truth unless they think it's their only exit. "Hid what?" I asked, and I kept my tone curious, almost gentle, like I was helping him confess. "Documents," he hissed. "Names, agreements, things that will bring people to your door." And then he added quickly, like he was trying to regain control, "And you just handed them a reason to look." I stared out the windshield at the streetlights smearing across the glass, and my mind started replaying every strange detail from my childhood like a highlight reel. The locked drawer in a study I was never allowed to open, the sudden out-of-state trips that were called business, but had no photos, the way Grandpa Samuel used to pause mid-sentence whenever my father walked into the room, the way he'd press his lips together like he was swallowing words. "Dad," I said slowly, "are you telling me Grandpa's money is dirty?" My father's laugh came again, thinner this time. Don't be stupid, he snapped, and then he corrected himself fast. No, not dirty, strategic. And that word told me everything because men like him call crimes strategy so they can sleep at night. Mark leaned closer and whispered, "Keep him talking about specifics." And I felt my pulse in my ears because now this wasn't just revenge, it was discovery. And discovery is what keeps viewers glued because the truth is always uglier than what we guessed. If it's not dirty, I said, then why are you scared? My father exhaled hard. Because your grandfather had leverage, he said, and that one word hit me like cold water. Because leverage is the real currency in families like mine. Not love, not loyalty, leverage. Leverage on who? I asked, and I could hear my own voice tighten despite my effort. On people you don't want to know, my father said. And then he tried another tactic, softer, almost paternal. Alyssa, listen, I can fix this. I can make it go away. You just have to do what I say next. Mark's mouth turned into a small, humorless smile because, of course, even after getting cuffed, my father still thought he could give orders. What do you want? I asked. He didn't say, I want my daughter safe. He didn't say, I'm sorry. He said, you need to sign a statement that you were misled, that you misunderstood, and then you need to transfer the trust into a neutral holding entity. And he said neutral the way scammers say secure. And then he added, if you don't, you're going to lose everything. I glanced at Mark, and he shook his head once, a clear no, and I knew why. Because the moment I sign anything, I become a participant in his rewrite. I'm not signing anything, I said, and then, because I wanted the audience to feel it in their bones, I added, you taught me how signatures work, Dad. You taught me that once your name is on paper, you belong to that paper. He went silent for a beat, and then his voice erupted. After everything I've done for you, he shouted, and I almost laughed because there it was, the classic line every toxic parent uses when they want repayment for basic parenting, as if feeding your child was an invoice. Everything you've done, I repeated, like calling me trash at a celebration, like drowning Grandpa's pages in champagne, like telling people I was nothing unless I obeyed, like raising Chase to think hurting me is a hobby. My father's breathing turned heavy and fast, like he was pacing, and then he said something that made Mark's eyes widen. You don't know why Samuel chose you, he said, and his tone turned sour, jealous. He didn't choose you because you're special. He chose you because you're expendable. My throat went tight, and I said, explain that. He hesitated, and you could hear him calculating, and then he said, your grandfather knew I'd take it if he left it in the open, he said. So he buried it in you because he knew you'd keep your head down and do what you're told. Mark whispered, that's motive, and I felt rage flare hot under my ribs, not the scream kind, the clean, surgical kind. So Grandpa used me as a vault, I said quietly, and then I added, and you used me as a mop. My father snapped, don't twist this. And then his voice went lower. Alyssa, there's a second item. And that made my skin prickle because when a villain says second item, it means the story is about to tilt. What second item? I asked. The passbook was the key, he said, but it wasn't the only key. And then he said the sentence that changed the air in the car. Your grandfather left something else, and it's not money. And if that comes out, it doesn't just destroy me. It destroys your mother. I froze, because he'd never used my mother like that before, not as a person, as a shield. Mark's jaw tightened, and he whispered, he's trying to hook you emotionally. My father rushed on, sensing he'd finally found my soft spot. Your mother didn't know what she married, he said. She did what she had to do to survive. And I could hear him trying to paint himself as the monster so she could look like a victim, which is hilarious coming from a man who never let anyone else be the victim. Dad, I said, steady again. Tell me exactly what Grandpa left. He didn't answer, not directly, because he couldn't control a direct answer. He said, meet me tomorrow alone. And then he added, too quickly, bring the passbook. Mark shook his head harder this time, and I felt my pulse hammer because this was the fork in the road, the baited meeting in the dark that stories are built on, and I knew if I said yes, he'd try to trap me, but if I said no, I might lose the one truth Grandpa wanted me to have. So, I did the only thing that gets control back from a manipulator. I set terms. You don't get a loan. I said, you've had me alone my whole life, and look what you did with it. He snarled, then you'll regret it. And I said, maybe, and then I dropped my voice, but you're the one in handcuffs, Dad, not me. Silence. And then he whispered something like a threat and a plea at the same time. If you open that second file, you'll wish you hadn't. And the line went dead. Mark didn't speak for a few seconds, just stared at the dashboard like he was already building a map, and then he said, there's a second file, and your grandfather set it up to trigger only after the account was claimed. And my mouth went dry because that meant Grandpa didn't just give me money. He gave me a timed truth bomb, and the only question now is who it was meant to protect, and who it was meant to bury, and if you're watching, I need you to tell me honestly, would you meet a father like mine to hear the truth, or would you let the truth come to you through paperwork? Because tomorrow we were going to the bank again, not for a balance, but for the hidden envelope that made my father's voice shake, and I already knew the moment I touched it. The story would stop being about inheritance and start being about the real reason my father built an empire on cruelty in the first place. The next morning we didn't rush to the bank like a movie. We moved like people who've learned that panic makes you sloppy, and sloppy is how predators win. So Mark and I left Boston before the commuter traffic thickened, coffee sweating in the cup holders, my hands cold even with the heater on because my body still remembered that gala room and the DOJ seal and my father's face twisting like the mask finally cracked. And then we parked 2 blocks away on purpose so we could walk the last stretch and check our surroundings like I do before walking into an unfamiliar trauma bay. And when we got to the First National branch, the same security guard recognized me and did that small, respectful nod. Not because he suddenly cared about me as a person, but because institutions respect paper and power, and now the paper said I had both. We didn't go to the marble lobby this time. We went straight to the private door because the director, Miss Klein, was already waiting, and she didn't waste words. She said, Miss Mercer, your grandfather placed a sealed addendum with a trust. It becomes accessible only after the first claimant verification and only to you. And she slid a clipboard toward me with a short form that basically said I was requesting access to ancillary documents. And Mark leaned in and whispered, read the fine print anyway, because the fastest way to get outplayed is to assume you're finally safe. I read every line, twice, and then I signed in black ink. And then Ms. Klein took my signature like it was a key, walked us down a hallway that smelled like paper and cold air, and opened a heavy steel door using a code and a physical key, and then another key. And I'm telling you these steps because people think banks are just computers, but real money and real secrets still live behind metal, behind procedures, behind people who have to sign their names that they were the ones who opened the door. Inside the viewing room, the same leather chair, the same dust smell, and on the table a slim envelope, not a thick file, just one envelope with my name typed perfectly, and across the seal a small embossed stamp that read, S. Mercer, and my stomach flipped because suddenly this wasn't about my father anymore. It was about my grandfather, and how quiet men plan wars without ever raising their voice. Ms. Klein said, this was deposited in 2011, updated in 2019, and it contains instructions, a letter, and a list of recipients. And Mark's eyebrows lifted at recipients, because that word means my grandfather didn't just want me to know something. He wanted other people to be forced to know it too. I placed my fingers on the seal and paused, and if you're listening, I want you to feel that moment. That microsecond where you realize your whole childhood might have been shaped by facts you never got to see. And then I broke the seal carefully, like opening a sterile pack. No tearing, no drama, and I slid out 3 items. A letter, 2 pages of typed instructions, and a smaller folded paper clipped to a business card that simply read, H. Doyle. Yes, Mark quietly said, an attorney, and I nodded because of course it was. Grandpa Samuel wasn't leaving a truth bomb without a fuse, and lawyers are fuses with suits on. I opened the letter first, and my throat tightened instantly, because it started with, Alyssa, if you are reading this, then Richard finally showed you who he is in public. And I almost laughed because Grandpa didn't just predict betrayal, he predicted the stage, he predicted the audience, he predicted the cruelty, and he wrote it down like a man filling out a weather report. The letter was not long, but every sentence hit like a measured slap, and he didn't call my father evil. He called him predictable, and that hurt more because evil implies mystery, predictable implies choice. Grandpa wrote, I watched you clean up messes that were never yours, and I watched Richard train you to think obedience was love, and I watched him treat your brother like a prince and you like a household tool, and I stayed longer than I should have because I was afraid if I left, you'd have no witness. And I'm not going to pretend I didn't blink hard at that line, because older viewers know this kind of family, the kind where the abuser loves to rewrite history and the victim starts doubting their own memory, and having one person say, I saw it, is like oxygen. Then Grandpa wrote, Richard's empire is not an empire. It is debt-wearing cologne. And if you claim this trust, Richard will come for it like a starving man, and he will try to use your mother as bait, and he will try to use your brother as a weapon, and he will try to use your guilt as a chain. And Mark mouthed, he nailed it, because that's exactly what my father tried on the phone. Then came the part that made my skin go cold. Grandpa wrote, the second file is not about money, it is about accountability. And then he listed what he called the mercy ledger, which sounded kind until you realized mercy ledgers are still ledgers and ledgers still keep score. Grandpa explained that in the early 2000s my father took out private loans using the family name, not the family assets, and he did it by forging Samuel Mercer's signature on comfort letters to lenders, letters that implied backing that did not exist, and he used those letters to secure bridge loans to cover other bridge loans. And if you've ever watched someone juggle bills by opening a new card to pay the old card, you know the smell of that spiral, except my father did it with suits and galas and charity plaques, so people would confuse optics for solvency. Grandpa wrote that he discovered the forged letters, confronted Richard privately, and Richard did what Richard always does. He blamed someone else, he blamed advisors, he blamed miscommunication, and then he threatened to cut Samuel off from the family and from me, and Grandpa wrote, he threatened a man who had already lost his wife and was not afraid of loneliness, but he was afraid of what he would do to you. And then he wrote the line that answered the question my father tried to poison me with. I did not choose you because you were expendable. I chose you because you were the only one with a spine strong enough to survive him and a conscience strong enough not to become him. I put the letter down and my hands were shaking, and Mark didn't touch me. He just sat closer, and Miss Klein quietly stepped out because she understood this wasn't a banking moment anymore. It was a family autopsy. I opened the instruction pages next, and this is where Grandpa turned from kind to surgical because he laid out a step-by-step plan like he was writing discharge instructions for a patient named Richard Mercer. Step 1 was already complete. Claim the trust in person with claimant verification. Step 2 was to contact attorney Henry Doyle using the card provided, and provide him with a copy of the trust claim paperwork and any threats made by Richard after the claim. Step 3 was a list of 3 recipients for a sealed packet attorney Doyle already held in escrow: the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office, and a named private lender consortium. And the trigger condition was simple and brutal: release upon evidence of coercion, extortion, or attempt to seize beneficiary assets. In other words, Grandpa didn't just leave me money, he left me a tripwire, and my father had already stepped on it by threatening to sue me for elder manipulation and pushing me to sign neutral holding transfers. Mark exhaled and said, Your grandfather built a dead man switch. And I nodded because that's exactly what it was. An accountability machine that didn't require me to be brave every single day. It just required me to follow instructions. Then I unfolded the small clipped paper, and my stomach dropped again because it wasn't just business names. It was specific dates, lender names, letter identifiers, and a note that said, "Original forged comfort letters are stored in Vault Box 14C. Release only through Attorney Doyle." And I swear my heart did that slow, heavy thump because suddenly I understood why my father always needed an audience. Because when you build your life on fraud, you need applause to drown out the sound of your own lies. I looked at Mark and said, "He knew," and Mark said, "He documented." And that is the moral lesson right there for anyone listening who's dealing with family betrayal. Feelings don't win against manipulators. Documentation does. Paperwork does. Timelines do. Witnesses do, because abusers love fog. They love, he said, she said. And the fastest way to beat fog is to turn on fluorescent lights. We left the bank with copies of everything, certified copies, stamped and dated, because if you don't get it certified, it becomes a story instead of evidence. And then in the car I called attorney Henry Doyle on speaker, and he answered like he'd been expecting my voice for years. "Miss Mercer," he said calmly, "I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm proud of you for claiming what was left to you." And I didn't even know how to respond to that, so I went straight to facts. My father is threatening legal action and trying to force a transfer, and Doyle said, "Then we proceed to trigger." And he explained exactly how. He said he would file an immediate protective injunction to prevent any harassment or fraudulent filings against the cottage deed. He would notify the lender consortium that the guarantor letters were forged and that any claims should be redirected to the proper legal process. And he would deliver the sealed packet to IRS CID and the AG within 24 hours. And he said, "Your role is to stay quiet and let the system do what your family refused to do, which is enforce consequences." And here is the part people don't tell you. The hardest thing isn't revenge, it's restraint, because when you've been silenced your whole life, you want to scream the truth into the world, but screaming can mess up an investigation. So I did what Grandpa trained me to do. I followed the steps. That evening my father called again. Different number, same poison, and I didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail, and he left a message that sounded like a man watching the walls close in. "Alyssa, you're making a mistake. You're being influenced. You don't understand the people involved." And then he tried the oldest trick. "If you do this, your mother will never forgive you." And I listened to it once and forwarded it to Attorney Doyle, and then I deleted it, because that's the other moral lesson. You don't keep venom on your phone like it's a pet. You pass it to the right professional, and you get it out of your life. Within 48 hours, the headlines shifted from Gala Disruption to Mercer Foundation under federal investigation, and then the lender consortium filed civil claims, and then the Massachusetts AG opened an inquiry into charitable misrepresentation, and my father's lawyer tried to file an emergency motion claiming I was financially coerced by my spouse. And I'm telling you that because it's what these men do. When they can't control you, they try to paint you as controlled by someone else, because the idea of you choosing yourself is too humiliating for them to accept. The judge granted a temporary protective order against harassment and retaliation, and that mattered more to me than any dollar amount because it meant the system was finally doing what my family never did, drawing a line and saying, "No, you don't get to keep harming her just because you share blood." A week later, Mark and I drove to the cottage in Newport, and the place looked tired, ivy creeping up the shingles like it was trying to swallow the roof, salt air rusting the hinges, and I stood on that porch and I didn't feel rich. I felt safe for the first time in my life, and safety is the real inheritance. I pulled weeds with my own hands. I replaced the old lock myself. I called a roofer and asked questions like I belonged there because I did, and then I sat on the steps and laughed once. Not because it was funny, but because the absurdity hit me. My father spent his whole life performing wealth, and I was the one quietly gaining freedom with a toolbox and a legal file. So here's what I want you to do, and I mean it. Tell me in the comments the moment you realized someone in your family wasn't family in the way you deserved, and also tell me where you're watching from, because I read those like a map of who we're talking to. And if you've ever been pressured to keep peace by sacrificing your own future, I want you to write one sentence. I'm done absorbing consequences for people who choose chaos. Because that sentence changes how you walk through the world. And I'm not ending this like everything is neatly wrapped, because real life never is. The trust is mine, yes. The legal trap is sprung, yes. My father is fighting for heir, yes. But the next move is the one nobody expects, because my brother Chase didn't take the plea quietly. He tried to trade information for immunity, and the information he offered wasn't about my father, it was about my mother. And when Attorney Doyle said those words on the phone, he's trying to flip, I realized the final. Betrayal wasn't going to come from the man who always hated me. It was going to come from the person who smiled at family dinners while the knives stayed under the table. So if you want the next story, the one that shows exactly what I found in my mother's locked cedar chest and why it changed every memory I ever had of her, you're going to want to watch the next video. Because that's where the real reason Grandpa built the Mercy Ledger finally gets exposed. And it's not just about money. It's about who was complicit, who was trapped, and who was quietly pulling strings the whole time.